Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. My name is Jalen, also known as The Bar in the Bookcase on YouTube. Today, I am joined by Mona Awad, author of All's Well, which is recently out in paperback as well now. Also, Bunny and 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl. I am so excited about this because Bunny in particular has been one of my all-time favorite books, and it's been sitting up on my favorite shelf up there. And so this is just so incredible. So, Mona, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh my gosh, it's an honor. Thank you so much for having me on.
I want to start with All's Well, as this one just came out in paperback. Do you want to give a synopsis of All's Well for anyone that hasn't read it yet?
Art comedy, and it's set at a New England college. And it's about a theater professor named Miranda Fitch, who is struggling with chronic pain that no one believes she has. And she is hell bent on staging a student production of Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well. But her students are mutinous and they hate her, and they want Macbeth. Tragedy and comedy ensue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to start with this question of art being a centerpiece in your fiction.
Yeah.
Um, Going back to like Bunny as well, and then now All's Well, one is focusing on the theater program and one is focusing on an MFA program. And I'm wondering how you think about the performance of art or just creating art generally, how that like factors into how you think about novel writing yourself.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'm really interested in the act of creation and how much the act of creation reveals us in ways that we don't intend, you know? So Bunny is really all about that. It's all about that kind of experience of these things manifesting, that come from inside of you, that maybe you can't own or acknowledge. And I think in the case of All's Well, Miranda is struggling with really severe chronic pain, and she's a former actor, and she has this dream, right? Of returning to that former glory, to that former play that she loved, that she starred in, that was such an important role for her. And so she's, really trying to not only relive, but project that vision. And so much of that act of projection and creation just reveals the degree to which I think she's actually very sad and alone and, in pain. Like all of the comedy and the joy that she wants sort of reveals that inside, of course, it's the opposite for her. So I guess that's something that I think is really interesting to me about art, is that I think fantasy reveals emotional and psychological reality in really potent ways that excite me.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you talk about that because I think for both of these narrators, while they both are grappling with a certain sense of loneliness and autonomy and their explorations of these questions of their own identity, they're also forced to speak with others, and that creates many conflicts in both novels. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask you about the focus on university and group learning, I guess, in both
Mhm.
novels, and how difference between their loneliness versus those interactions and how that kind of plays for you in crafting the plot.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that yeah, they're both set at college campuses. And I guess I see that as fodder for horror, of course. Just because it's such a strange little world. The world of academia. It's so weird. It can feel so occult. You constantly feel like an outsider. So what you're talking about with this idea of isolation and kind of miscommunication with other people, I feel like part of that is just a product of being in that setting, because you're always second guessing your footing in an academic setting. At least that's been my experience. And so, yeah, so I thought that that's so great when you feel that kind of outsiderness, which is, such a universal experience. We all feel that way, at different points in our lives. How does that then, yeah, change your experience of reality? Right? How does that inform your relationships? How does it warp your relationships? And I really tried to lean into that, for the purposes of generating horror and for fun, with Bunny and with All's Well. Miranda's in kind of her own world of pain, doesn't really feel like she belongs there. And she's constantly thinking that people are against her. And they do gaslight her a lot. So yeah, it was definitely that setting, I think, allowed me to sort of play up that feeling of just being an imposter in a place.
I related so much to it because I am a lawyer and going to law school was one of the most like formative experiences, but also one of the most grueling and just, I don't know. I'm haunted by it still to this day in
Oh,
many aspects.
I'm sorry, but
So
I
I
understand.
yeah, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I don't know. So I think that's why I relate to these books so much is like this question. Also, I am an only child, so like I don't know, those kind of ideas of, I guess, loneliness or isolation or just kind of being in your own head versus the sort of external forces that can play or run amok in your brain is really interesting, and especially in fiction. But going to something
Yeah,
that you mentioned before in terms of like fairy tales and horror and using magical realism as like these mediums to explore dark human experiences, whether it be depression, chronic pain, longing. I guess in terms of all of these, and when you are deciding upon certain magical realist elements or horror elements to use in your fiction, how do you control the boundaries of that? Because I feel like I've been asking a lot of questions in this podcast series about like realism in fiction and wondering like what
mhm.
should you put in or what can you not, or how can you stretch the form? And so how do you think about that for yourself?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because on the one hand, I mean, I started in realism with 13 Ways. And I think in a lot of ways, looking at realism taught me a lot about how to be a writer in a way that is exciting, like to me, tell a story in a way that tries to stay true to psychological experience. So, movies by this British director, Mike Leigh, whom I love. A couple of his films, Another Year and Secrets and Lies. I just one of the things about his process that I find so interesting is that he gets the characters to sort of improvise. He doesn't write a script. He doesn't do that. He just tells them who they are and then maybe gives them a few elements of the scene, and then they are the ones who generate the dialogue and the story. And I learned so much from watching those films, much as I've always loved fairy tales and horror on the other hand. So for me, it is a very, very difficult and delicate balance. The trick, I think, that I always try to do, especially in when I'm working with the fantastic, which more and more I'm seeming to love to do that, is to really just stay as true as possible to the consciousness that I've committed to. So if I'm in, for example, Miranda's consciousness in All's Well, or if I'm in Sam's consciousness and Bunny, no matter how far I go down the rabbit hole with those characters, I'm going to try to stay true to what they might be experiencing viscerally and emotionally, moment to moment. And that always leads me through. So I guess it's a question of voice. Voice is what determines what you keep out and what you leave in. And voice is also the tether. The voice is the corridor to the fantastic, because when you're in your own consciousness, you spin stories, right, about your reality, and that may or may not be true, but they're real to you. So if I stay true to a consciousness, I also very organically can get to the fantastic very, very quickly that way, because we're always imagining things that may not be true, that may not be there, right?
Exploring these characters and their narration and what they're telling the reader, how do you situate the reader in that dynamic in terms of being a voyeur to their experiences? And do you consider them when you're writing, or do you think about it maybe later in revision? I'm just curious to how you consider readers.
The reader. No, I really deeply consider the reader, because for me, the most exhilarating thing about reading when I was young that really made me want to write were those kinds of books where I felt like the narrator, and I also felt like the author, was kind of really leaning into my ear, and telling me something dangerous and something intimate and something important, but a secret. And so I really like the story to feel that way. And that's part of the reason why I like first person. But I'm always thinking about the reader. And in All's Well, there's a lot of direct address, which comes from, it being about a former actor, and I love those characters in Shakespeare that direct themselves to the audience and try to and get the audience on their side. Those are my favorite characters. They're always very morally ambiguous and tricksterish. And it's fun. It's a pleasure for the audience, but it's also very dangerous too, because the border between, the audience and the play world sort of dissolves with that kind of character. And the audience can start to feel complicit. And maybe that's where there's a sense of danger too. So I really love that kind of narrator that gets really intimate very quickly with the reader. It's just more fun, and I think it feels like there's more at stake for the reader in finishing the story and moving through it with the narrator. So yeah, so I think about that a lot. In fact, thinking about the reader really helps me tell the story the way that I want to tell it.
And to tie that, I guess, to the idea of plays and performance in theater, particularly in All's Well, and putting on a production for someone that's viewing it, I wanted to ask you about the use of illusion and your ties to Shakespeare and thinking about, rendering other plays and using them in a novel. Like, what challenges or benefits, I guess, were like using another play to like help you explore these ideas?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, it was really intimidating. And it was Shakespeare is intimidating for sure, but I'm Canadian, and a lot of Canadian writers, they write like a book where they take on Shakespeare in some way. So I guess I've proven my Canadianness. I don't know. But it came out of like a real love for All's Well That Ends Well, and just a really like very visceral kind of violent reaction to it. I had such an issue with Helen, and that's kind of where it all started. She was such a polarizing character, and I thought how fascinating that no one's really taken this on. And I saw the director completely like committed to one kind of Helen, and then the story really started unfolding from there. But it was very intimidating to work with Shakespeare. And then when I added Macbeth on top of that, I had a whole other set of expectations around a tragedy. But what I did, and that something that really helped me, I remembered that Miranda wants to put on All's Well That Ends Well. She wants the comedy. That's what she wants her life to be. She wants the happy ending. That's the world that she wants. But there's another world off stage that she didn't choose and that she can't direct, that she has to live in. And that's the world of Macbeth. And so when I knew that there was the comedy on stage and then the tragedy off, it really, really helped me navigate those two theatrical worlds, and the intersections between them, because I actually think there are a lot of intersections between Macbeth and All's Well. So that was very fun. And then the idea of illusion in theater, because I love working with the fantastic, theater really gives so much permission for that. If I'm extending the stage to include the whole novel, and so all the world's a stage and all's well, then I can have a lot of fun with what's real, because of theater, right? So much license. So that was that was the most fun thing about Shakespeare. The challenge was the two plays. Once I kind of created that division, she's putting on the comedy, she's living the tragedy against her will. It became much more easy to navigate that.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've realized too, like in reading this year, is that I love tragic comedies generally, and I feel like horror often leans into that in terms
Yeah.
of, like, I'm thinking even of like some of the most dark or like movies that or books that mess me up significantly, like whether it's Hereditary or I was watching Trixie and Katya, two drag queens that I love.
Oh
They were
my God, I love Trixie and Katya.
I'm like obsessed with them. I met them recently, which was really cool.
You did? Oh my God.
Yeah, to
Wow.
meet and greet in at one of their shows, which was really fun. It was overwhelming,
I
but it
bet
was
it
cool.
was. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen Trixie by herself twice, and I've seen Katya by herself, but I've never seen them together, even though I love that show so much.
It's so
So,
good. And they're so hilarious together, and their show is like phenomenal. So if they, I know they're still touring,
okay, I'll
but
have
if
to try to
they,
catch
yeah, I highly recommend it.
it.
But I was watching their podcast, and Katya recently watched this movie called Terrifier 2, which
Okay.
is like a slasher film that I guess is incredibly gory. But she was saying how like at one point during one of the death scenes, like it was so graphic that like the audience was just started laughing because like they couldn't like they didn't know how to control their like response to what was going on. And I think that's interesting, like when we laugh when we watch
Yeah,
something really morbid happening in front of us.
yeah.
And so all that to say, I really think that there's an interesting blend between horror and comedy, or
Mhm.
tragedy and comedy, and there's a lot to be mined there, and I think you do it really well. So I guess I don't really know what my question is there, but do you think that's something that you will continue exploring in future work?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I so agree about that horror comedy thing that happens. I teach a horror class, and I'm teaching it this fall. And we watched Rosemary's Baby, and the ending of Rosemary's Baby is it's really horrifying. But students were laughing at certain moments, just like Katja was describing with the slasher. And I just think it's true. There's something I was listening to Stephen Graham Jones talk about this, and he said that, it has to do with the ratcheting up of tension, with the escalation, and then you either laugh or you scream, right? And the slasher really plays with that. Really plays with that. You could either laugh or you could scream, and maybe you laugh when you're supposed to scream, or you scream when you're supposed to laugh. I don't know, but that's definitely the vibe of the slasher. But horror does play with that. It's sometimes like very unexpectedly funny. When I talk about that with my students, we kind of all sort of we're thinking about like, how does that work? Why does that happen? And I think one of the things that's so cool about it is, if you do think that you're going to be scared, but then there's a swerve in expectation and something funny happens, you laugh, but then you know that the scare is still coming. So it almost amplifies the horror. But they're both so reliant on tension. And I feel like that's where they're really like linked. It's like this ratcheting up of like of tension that requires release. And so yeah, so I think that's it. And then also, I mean, tragedy and comedy are so deeply, deeply linked that I just feel like, yeah, of course comedy is in horror. And of course, horror is in comedy. It's not at all surprising, right? We laugh at like things that we know maybe we shouldn't. And that's part of like the pleasure of comedy, even the dark pleasure of it.
It's so interesting to think about. And like horror is one of the foundations. Like growing up, I've always been fascinated by it. And I've also
Yeah.
been hearing discussions about like queerness in horror and like why, to put it very simply, I was just watching. So I watch a lot of drag content,
Yeah, so do
but
I. So, yeah.
Violet and Gottmik were talking about like why queer people love like Halloween and horror and like exploring those
Yeah.
ideas too. I don't know, it's something I've been thinking about given October. But
Yes.
one other thing in terms of like fairy tale and moralism and
Mhm.
spinning a moral like in your
Yeah.
novels, or how do you think about morality? I guess in fiction generally.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I guess if I'm being honest, my first commitment is to my characters as believably as possible, as excitingly as possible, to completely trying to render their consciousness on the page, right, in a way that's exciting to read. And the truth of consciousness, I don't know. Sometimes it's moral, but sometimes it's really not. Sometimes it's super mean and petty and awful. Like in our heads, we're everything at once, right? We're kind, but we're also terrible. We're petty, but we're also very generous at the same time. you know. So I guess maybe that's where the morality comes in, is just the commitment to that it's a whole thing, right? It's neither one nor the other completely, and to commit to that kind of truth. Yeah, there is, maybe there's a morality to that, but the morality of the character may not be upstanding, but that's okay, because we're human and we're deeply, deeply, deeply flawed. And that's communicating that in story is part of is what art does, right? It communicates the truth of human experience. So it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I'm very, very committed to that.
I mean, I think it kind of speaks to also, I guess, the grayness between comedy and horror too. Just trying to find like the moral ambiguity and what can be
Yeah,
mined there in terms of finding some essence of truth. I guess I think
yeah,
your work does that incredibly well, and my favorite writers do. Like another, I just had Tessa Moshfegh on the podcast last week, and we talked about this question too, and like just the question of like unlikable characters is something that comes up a
yes,
lot in common in recent discourse. And so,
yes.
on that note, I'm wondering about you and doing press for your book, and then also, I guess, TikTok and like I
Mhm,
guess the perception of your books. Do
mhm.
you like consume that sort of content, and what do you like make of it, if anything?
Well, I'm not really on TikTok. Like I guess I have an account, but I've never posted anything, and I haven't really looked at anything. So anything I see is on Instagram, which is the only social media thing that I have. I mean, I know that the book has a life on TikTok, and that Bunny does. It's very moving to me. I mean, that's really how I feel. I feel deeply, deeply moved that readers connect with the story, that they connect with All's Well too. And that's incredibly exciting to me. Yeah, I mean, that's why you write, right? You write to connect with people. So and in a lot of ways it has nothing to do with me anymore. It's the weirdest thing that happens when you finish a book. And it makes me very sad. It happens every time. When I finish a book and I turn it in, I do feel like I've lost it. Like it's not mine anymore. Because it isn't. It belongs to readers now. Reading is a really creative act. It's very creative and it's deeply personal. And so when a reader reads my book, they're creating the story for themselves. It's their book now. So I guess that's the thing that's so exciting, is that it has a life with readers who are creating their own stories out of it. That makes me deeply excited.
I'm really intrigued. I have a question that kind of relates to what you just said. So I'll just hop into the next, I guess, segment. I wanted to ask you about your experience teaching and being at Syracuse University. And
Mhm.
to start with this question, I recently, or last year, I read George Saunders' book, A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, which is just one of the most like important books to me that I can't stop talking about. And I just, as a reader, I'm not a writer myself, but as a reader, I learned so much from it. And I guess I wanted to ask you, how has teaching like informed your writing since starting?
It's such a good question. I think the main thing, because I teach what we call forms classes, which is where George Saunders' book comes from. He taught a class on the Russians for many, many years. And that book comes from that class. All the stories that he looks at are on the syllabus of that class. And, he uses them as ways to talk about different aspects of form and different aspects of craft and character and all of these wonderful things. And so I teach two forms classes as well. Well, I teach three, but one of them is a horror class, and the other is a fairy tale class. And I also teach a class on villains. So those classes where you kind of are going more deeply into work that excites you, and you have the opportunity to do that and to share it with students and to hear what they have to say about it, and together creatively you're sort of thinking in fresh ways about what the text might be trying to do. It's incredibly exciting and it's very inspiring. So I guess I would say that it's made me love horror in a whole new way. Like it's really, really, really done that. And fairy tale too. And then seeing students connect with it and try it out, that's incredibly exciting as well. So I guess, yeah, it just deepens my connection to what storytelling can really do.
That's so interesting. I would love to take your classes. It sounds really fun. But I mean, in terms of, I guess, do you have anything that you think readers could take away from a creative writing program, even if they're not writers themselves, that might help their reading, I guess?
Yeah, I think that it does it paying close attention to what's happening on the line. And I remember that happened to me when I took a poetry class in my undergrad, because I was an English major. And I remember the professor sort of went, line by line, but I felt like my mind got blown. It was so exciting to see what you could really do on the page to create that the kind of effect that I was never able to articulate, and still quite I can't really still. Like when work is really, really great, I still ultimately don't really have very many words for why it's great and for what I'm feeling. Like it still kind of just leaves me silent. But to have the opportunity to think about it, to think deeply about it, and maybe even respond to it, try it out, on the page, even if you don't want to be a writer. I think that deepens your relationship to storytelling and what storytelling can do, and it enriches your reading life. You know, I think that's what it can do for readers.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I've been having some, or this year I had some preoccupations with like being online and like reviewing books. And sometimes I
Yeah,
find I'm so struck by a book that like I don't know how to articulate it. And I think that's a really interesting feeling to have. I recently read this book by Amina Kane called A Horse at Night. And she talks about this experience of like sometimes you need to sit for maybe years with a book to really understand like what's going on with it and how it
yeah,
touches you. I think it's an interesting experience reading a book and how it's so individualistic while
yes.
also being a like direct tether to a writer's mind. I think it's like the distinction between reader and writer is so interesting to me. So thank you for touching on that.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. It's really true. It's really true. And the book is I guess the book is the thing between, and the book really does feel, once I've written it and it's in print and it's out there, of course, I remember the experience of writing it, and I mean, writing Bunny gave me so much joy. I mean, it was very joyful, and writing All's Well too. I mean, it was very emotional at times when I was at different parts of the story, but it was joyful. And looking at the book now on the shelf, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I have to remind myself that I wrote it because it really truly doesn't feel like mine anymore. But I think in a way that's good. It's good for artists to feel that way, like to get that distance. It's important because it really does belong to readers now.
In terms of how you think about your craft going forward from also teaching it and constantly thinking about novel writing as a practice, I'm wondering, is there anything that's still maybe intimidating or that you're kind of that you want to grapple in a future work or you want to stay away from for whatever reason? Like what, I guess, intimidates you with writing still?
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, it's always intimidating. I mean, if it weren't, I wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? Like it's scary. It's very scary. I'm finishing a new book now. I'm turning it in. It'll come out next September. It was terrifying to write. It was terrifying. And for all the basic reasons. Plot, am I staying true to this character? Like, do I have this right? Do I have the world right? Am I all these things? They always come up when you're working. You're always second guessing yourself, but you still have to keep moving forward. So I think yeah, it's just the act of writing is kind of terrifying, but it's also, I mean, for me, it's exhilarating, on its best days. And even on the days when it's not great, there's nothing I'd rather be doing. So yeah, it's scary, but I'll take it. And that's probably good that it's scary because it keeps me on my toes.
Yeah, and then if you keep being called back to it, I think that's clear that you're making the right choice with what you're
Yeah,
doing. So
yeah,
that's
exactly.
nice. So I guess in terms of your own reading yourself, who
Yeah.
or what influences like what you pick up next?
Hmm. Well, I was a bookseller for a really long time, in my teens. And all of the writers that, I held very, very close to my heart at that time were all recommendations from booksellers that I worked with, and it felt like I was being like given like this incredible treasure, each time. So I guess that's still true that there are booksellers that I trust, and writers also. Writers are great because they're always reading weird stuff, that like maybe not a lot of people know about. So that's always fun, and so you can really pick up some strange things that way. I like reading, stuff that surprises me. Yeah, I want to be really taken away, but I want like the language to be exciting and surprising and fresh. So that can be a tall order. But yeah, writers and readers, I guess, basically, still.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like the power of someone like personally telling you like you should read this for whatever
Yeah.
reason, like that's like the most powerful feeling because then there's again like a connection with the person and they see something like in you or something to
Mhm.
recommend it to you. But also I think writers like on this podcast, I always ask for book recommendations, so I'll get into it. But I found some of my favorite books that way. So I wanted to start by asking, is there anything recently that you read that you really enjoyed?
It's not new. Is that okay? Yeah.
Totally fine.
All right. Well, I had to reread The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And I just cannot believe how brilliant that book is. I cannot believe how good it is. It's incredible. It's so funny. It's so weird. It's so truly terrifying. And it's so misanthropic, and it's such a critique of like people and social dynamics, and it's amazing, And it's like it's got wonder in it, which is like really, really hard to get down on the page, but she does it so beautifully. And I was just blown away by it. I think it's just a terrific book. So yeah, I guess that's my recommendation. I know it's a classic, but Shirley Jackson, The Haunting of Hill House. Read it if you haven't. It's
I need
wonderful.
to read it. Like I've only read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, but I still haven't read that one, so I will for sure.
Oh, yeah, you'll love it. I mean, We Have Always Lived in the Castle is wonderful too. It's so good. But if you did love that, you will love The Haunting of Hill House. You will love
Okay.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And I guess the last like book recommendation question is do you have any upcoming releases or books that you're looking forward to that are coming out soon or next year?
Next year, yeah. I think there's a new Brian Evanson collection I'm always excited by a new Brian Evanson collection. His story collections are amazing.
Sweet,
Yeah.
thank you. And I guess less maybe bookish question for you, but I know this will be posted the weekend of Halloween. So do you have any like plans for Halloween, or like what do you like to do to get in the horror spirit?
Well, I teach my horror class on Halloween. So because it meets on Mondays. So we will be looking at the slasher. So we're going to look at Scream, and we're also going to look at Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones, and we'll look at them together, and that'll be really, really fun. I might dress up, but like in a gothy way. Like maybe I'll wear like a lot of black. I mean, I always wear black, but I'll wear more. So yeah. But I think that will be a fun day. And I'll probably, buy donuts for everybody or something. Creepy donut. Yeah.
I love that. Slasher is my favorite subgenre of horror, so I'm
Oh yeah.
jealous of your students. That's awesome. Scream is my favorite movie, of
Isn't it
course.
so good?
It's so
It's
good.
it's so good.
And I never
And
like it never gets old at
I
all.
know. I know. It's truly, truly good. Like, I mean, it's so much fun. It's got that great Nick Cave song in it, plays with all the tropes of horror. It's so much fun. It's so funny. I love it.
Have you seen the latest one that came out this year?
I haven't. Is it good? Did you watch it?
I watched it and I really enjoyed it. It's like incredibly meta going back to the original Scream, in terms of it being like a revamp of sorts with new characters. I really liked it, but I see a lot of Scream fans are quite like divided over it. So I'd be curious to hear what you make of it if you watch it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll definitely send you a message when I do and tell you what I think. I'm
Yeah, that'd be
curious.
awesome. I
Yeah.
know that the next one's going to be set, I think, in New York City,
Okay.
the sequel to that one. So, yeah, I'm curious. It seems like it'd be a really tough feat to like continue a franchise for that long.
Yeah.
But they do
Yeah.
a pretty good job, like staying true to Scream, I think. But
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a very particular kind of sensibility. And it really does walk that line between horror and the comic, but the darkly comic.
yeah, absolutely. They're so thrilling and so funny, but also I always am like constantly riveted throughout the entire thing, and I love how self-aware it is. Like that's something I love in fiction too,
Yes.
is when it feels like the writer is very aware of the form that they're using to tell you the story, and that just I think that's why I love Scream. So everyone watch Scream if you haven't seen it already. I know most
Definitely.
probably have, but
I second it. Yeah, for sure.
and also check out Mona Awad's books as well. Thank you, Mona, so much for coming on the podcast. This is so fun. I love talking about horror and the weird questions that kind of come out of horror. It's just such a fun thing to think about. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jalen. It was such a pleasure. And yeah, hopefully we'll connect again soon.